Hello, and welcome to Hopkins at Home. Thank you for joining us. My name is Camille Fesche. I grew up 15 minutes north of the Homewood campus, and I'm a proud Blue Jay, graduating with my bachelor's from the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences in 2002. At Hopkins, I started on the varsity field hockey team, served as secretary and treasurer of my class, and became an Alpha Phi sister. I'm still in Maryland and now a lawyer and co-chair of the Government Relations Division at the firm of Raskin, Weiner, Livingston. Today, we are presenting a fireside chat style discussion about the details and implications of the transition of presidential power from President Trump to President-elect Joe Biden. I'm honored to introduce the guests for this discussion. My friend, Congressman Jamie Raskin, serves on the House Judiciary Oversight and Rules Committees. He was a professor of constitutional law for a quarter century at American University, Washington College of Law before entering Congress, and has published several books, including the Washington Post bestseller, Overruling Democracy, The Supreme Court versus the American People, and We the Students, Supreme Court Cases for and About America's Students. Prior to serving in Congress, Jamie Raskin was a three-term state senator in Maryland, where he served as Senate Majority Whip and led floor fights to pass marriage equality, abolish the death penalty, crack down on drunk driving, and enact equal pay for equal work legislation. Professor Daniel Schlozman received his PhD in government and social policy from Harvard University, and he is currently the Joseph and Bertha Bernstein Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses. His book, When Movements Anchor Parties, Electoral Alignments in American History, was published in 2015 from Princeton University Press. The book emphasizes the crucial role in American party development of alliances between political parties and social movements. Dr. Schlozman is now working on two additional books. One provisionally titled The Hollow Parties on Party Development Since the Founding with Sam Rosenfeld of Colgate University, and another about the relationship between the financialization and center-left parties in the US and the UK since the 1970s. We welcome you to ask any questions you have by typing them into the chat module on your screen throughout the talk, and there will be time at the end to answer them. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to Professor Schlozman to get the conversation started.
Morning, thanks, great to be here. So, Representative, start with a general kind of question, which is, what opportunities do you see for the next 4 years, at least the next 2 years, given either divided government or maybe the very, very narrowest margins of unified government? What do you think is going to get done, what might get done, and what's not?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Daniel, delighted to be with you. Camille, thank you for your very thoughtful and kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with all of my friends from Hopkins. Well, obviously we're all hoping for the best here. The way I think of it is that we've got the opportunity, or the Biden administration's got the opportunity to advance the cross-partisan, coalitional, common sense, common ground agenda that Donald Trump really could have done and should have done, and probably would have gotten him reelected had he done it. That is, you start with the crying issues of real emergency to the American people, like infrastructure, and say, okay, that's something that affects everybody, and we need to have a massive investment in the American infrastructure, the roads, the highways, the transit systems, the ports, the airports, cyber security, all of it, in a way that advances rather than undermines our environmental goals. And I think that should be a winning ticket, although a lot of people think that the fact that Donald Trump never did it reflects the fact that there's not the political support there within the GOP. But I think that if it's not there across the board in the GOP, it certainly would be popular enough with some of the suburban Republicans that they would have to go with it. And that's something we could work on. I had a resolution passed overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis on Monday, Daniel, to condemn religious persecution around the world and to demand the release of religious prisoners, people being held on trumped up charges of blasphemy and apostasy and heresy. And the Republicans got behind it. So we might also be able, just as we focus on the weakening physical infrastructure of the country, we can recapture the constitutional and ethical and moral and spiritual infrastructure of the country too, by finding the values that cut across the lines of partisan conflict. And I think that religious freedom is one that unifies both progressives who don't want to see the governments of the world persecuting the people for their beliefs, and also a lot of conservatives who, stand up for the basic value of religious freedom of conscience and thought. So that's going to be our challenge, is to find those pathways for consensus. I'm hoping that criminal justice reform is another one where we've, dipped our toes in the water with the Republicans. And when I was in Annapolis, we had great bipartisan support for things like abolishing mandatory minimum sentences in drug cases and decriminalization and, medical marijuana program. We even had some Republican support for abolishing the death penalty. So I think that there are some libertarian strains within the Republican coalition that could connect up with the increasingly progressive thrust of the Democratic Party.
In 2017, you voted against a waiver, to a more specific transition question. You voted against a waiver for General Mattis to serve as the Secretary of Defense. In January, you're going to have to weigh whether to give General Austin a waiver. What are you going to be considering as you weigh your vote, and how does this specific question, should former, recently serving military officer serve in charge of the Pentagon, relate to your broader views about what's the role of the military in public life? How do you see representing a district that's Democrat representing a district with a lot of defense adjacent constituents? What are you thinking about this? What are your colleagues thinking?
Well, the underlying value that needs to be vindicated here is civilian control of the military. That's a basic premise of American constitutional democracy and of democracy anywhere. And that's where the rule comes from, that we don't appoint people from the military to be Secretary of Defense within, I think, 7 years is the rule. And there is something a little bit arbitrary about that. That's the thing that gave me pause the last time with Mattis, as well as the fact that Mattis was a voice of reason and someone who we looked to for some stability and loyalty and fidelity to the constitutional regime. But it's a dangerous thing to go near there. So I guess for me, it's not an ironclad absolute, but it is a kind of presumption. The waiver provision is in there for a reason. If it can be shown that somebody's really needed, then we can waive that rule. And so, I suppose my mind is open. Some people have said, well, the Republicans got a waiver, so let the Democrats get a waiver. That's one way of thinking about it. Another is just that now is the time to emphatically reassert the civilian principle. I'm trying not to think about the particular personalities involved in it. The other person whose name was heavily bandied about, Michelle Flournoy, was a college classmate of mine, so I do know Michelle, but I've got nothing against General Austin, who seems like he would probably do a great job too.
I want to ask a little bit about the transition from the other side, and in turn your thoughts on the other party and where we're going. So last week, 126 or something like that of your colleagues signed an amicus brief in support of Texas's attempt to overturn the presidential vote in enough states that we would overturn the 2020 presidential election. So how do you, and I'm sort of asking you with your congressman hat and sort of with your law professor hat, how do you see this development? I mean, is this just posturing? Is this a serious move toward Democratic backsliding? It's how surprising is this? How's this going to play out in the House chamber? There's all sorts of questions that Pandora's box that's opened up, and I'm curious what you're thinking.
I mean, it's a scandalous and abominable development from the standpoint of constitutional fidelity and faithfulness towards democratic principles. I can't say it's surprising after everything that I've seen, after everything we've lived through the last 4 years. The neo-Nazis marching in major cities, and the president identifying very fine people on both sides of that, and the constant assaults on the separation of powers, the outrageous obstructionism and defiance of congressional subpoenas and congressional will, the tacit acceptance of Russian interference in American political institutions and our elections. I mean, nobody can claim to be astonished by this development. I mean, it's the easiest thing in the world as a member of Congress to put your name on an amicus brief, and perhaps the most charitable way of thinking about it is, well, it's not that big a deal. Somebody sent a memo around and said, put your name on this thing if you really love Donald Trump, which all of them do now. But to me, there is a difference between a political party and a religious cult. I mean, you don't suspend critical thinking because you're a member of a political party. You do when you're in a religious cult. You just do whatever the cult leader does and tells you to do. But I would hope that my colleagues would be above, sleeping in the back of a van and selling flowers and incense at Dulles Airport. So I've been dispirited by what they've done. Some of my Democratic colleagues are saying that this is akin to sedition, and that they shouldn't be seated. By signing this. I mean, that might be an overboard reaction. After all, people do have a right to be wrong and to go to court. That's different from what the president's supporters and the Proud Boys were doing this weekend, roaming around the nation's capital and beating people up and stabbing people. That does look like seditious activity and insurrectionist activity. And there's certainly people, like General Flynn, who've been saying really seditious things about the perpetual reign of Donald Trump and overthrowing the election and so on. But, I wouldn't kick somebody out for, putting their name to a stupid amicus brief for perhaps the dumbest lawsuit ever filed as a matter of original jurisdiction before the U.S. Supreme Court by Texas. I mean, there was no standing. It was a completely political question. They were trying to get a certain state to be able to intervene to stop electors in another state from casting their ballots according to the legitimate electoral process of the other state. There was no cause of action. There's no legal theory. And the relief being demanded for all of these non-constitutional offenses was outrageous, which was to overturn an election and disregard the votes of millions of people. So I think it's pathetic and humiliating that members of Congress would assign their name to it. And I do think that the ones who are from Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Georgia, in other words, the members who were from the states that they were claiming had illegitimate elections, they do need to pass a higher level of scrutiny in terms of being seated, because they're basically saying that the electoral process in their own state was invalid and illegitimate. And so either they need to correct the record and say they just put their name on a stupid piece of paper and didn't know what they were doing, or there really is a problem, but here's why it affected the presidential election but didn't affect my own election. But there should be some level of intellectual integrity and consistency to what they're saying about the election in their own district, in their own state.
go back to the 19th century and talk about the days when you guys spent much of your time deciding which of your colleagues to seat. I want to ask about same question in the executive branch, and probably less relevant to your day-to-day life in the House. Questions about whether we should move on from the Trump years, investigate the Trump years. Joe Biden has said the Justice Department will do its thing, but it's unclear quite what that means. If you view the last 4 years as being a total disaster, but at the same time would like to unify the country, those two are in some kind of tension if you push them each to the horizon, and in what ways the one should take precedence over the other, how, in what areas the one should take precedence over the other, how from the House you would view that maybe differently than you had.
Look, we're living in a time of staggering crises and catastrophes. We are in the middle of a plague that has killed 300,000 of our people. We're losing basically the number of Americans every single day that we lost in the 9/11 attacks. We're losing more than 3,000 people every single day in COVID-19. So we have this public health nightmare we're living through. We have an opioid crisis that's facing us. We have a crisis still within the criminal justice system and of police brutality and unequal administration of the laws according to race. And then all of that's taking place in the context of calamitous changes in the climate, with 4.5 million acres lost in California and Oregon, in Washington, and record drought and record flooding in parts of the country. Entire islands being submerged in other parts of the world, and the glaciers are vanishing at a nightmarish rate. So look, that is the forward-looking emergency agenda of the country. Having said that, I hope everybody would agree with me that if there's a president in office, or all the president's men, who committed murder in office or committed rape, we wouldn't say, let's let bygones be bygones and hold hands and sing kumbaya about that. If you violate the law in the United States of America, under the rule of law, you should be prosecuted for it. And that's just as true of bank fraud and real estate fraud and tax fraud as it is of murder and rape, unless people really think that being president of the United States or being friends with the president of the United States should be a get out of jail free card without even having to use the pardon power, and I just don't see it that way. Having said that, one of the terrible trespasses of the Trump administration was the collapse of the idea of an independent law enforcement branch, an independent Department of Justice. That has got to be a law enforcement decision. It should not be made by Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or any other political official. We should go back to the idea, another basic norm and value ruined by Donald Trump, but we should go back to the idea that the Department of Justice makes independent prosecutorial judgments and decisions, and the U.S. attorneys should do that. And so I hope that the Southern District of New York and the District of Columbia and Northern District of Virginia will make their own calls about facts brought to them indicating criminal offenses. And as to the serial offenses against the constitutional structure, yes, we in Congress do have to, while we're pursuing our forward-looking agenda on the policy crises that we're inheriting, we also do have to deal with those, so we never again have a president, for example, who decides to convert the presidency into an instrument of money-making and profiteering, and including violating the Foreign Emoluments Clause by collecting booty from governments from all over the world, or collecting money from the US government beyond his salary. We had a president who was saying, oh, I'm not going to take my salary. That's the only thing he can accept from the federal government. He can't be taking money at Mar-a-Lago and the golf courses in New Jersey or the Trump National Hotel in Washington, which I call the Washington emolument. We've got to get back to constitutional basics. And so at the same time that we're addressing these crises, I think that we do have to rebuild the guardrails and the fences to prevent this from happening again.
Thanks. So I want to ask a little bit about what's going on inside the Democratic Caucus. In particular, you remember the Progressive Caucus. There have been discussions, you've been part of them, about whether you stay as a quite big tent, relatively limited barriers to entry, pay whatever little fee it is and sign yourself up, or function as a much more cohesive block with formal positions, some kind of discipline. So I want to ask, first of all, how you're thinking about the Progressive Caucus, and then, yeah, start there and I'll ask my question.
Well, I think about the Progressive Caucus the way I think about the Democratic Caucus, which is I want it to be a vast, inclusive, comprehensive movement. And, you know, I don't want a progressive club. I want a progressive country. I want a country that is, you know, vindicating all of the animating values of our Constitution, equality and liberty and justice for everybody. So that militates away from a model of a cohesive little block that just kind of exercises its leverage at the margins. I want a progressive caucus. I want a Democratic caucus. I want a Democratic Party that is the party of everyone. We've seen the Republican Party become an extremist sect that has the most kind of fundamentalist views on the power of corporations and the power of right-wing religion in the country. And people know where that leads. And I am not for a political party as a religious cult. I don't support that. And so that's kind of where I come down on it.
What's it like? You are now you're characterized yourself a downline liberal, a progressive, that there's, for the first time in a good long while in American politics, a block, a squad to your left. Not that big, but quite prominent and representing something that's pretty important. What are the advantages and disadvantages, the opportunities and limits, both for the party writ broad and for you maneuvering around the House caucus to have a squad around?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I guess you can view it in ideological or you can view it in generational terms. Okay, so let's start with it ideologically. What I said through this campaign was, when my Republican colleagues, call me a liberal, a lot of them will say, Raskin, you're not a bad guy, but the problem with you is you're liberal. I say, you're damn right I'm a liberal. The heart of the word liberal is liberty. And if we're not fighting for liberty, what are we fighting for? And I'm a progressive because the heart of that word is progress. If we're not making progress, then what are we doing in politics? But I really stuck it to them because in the 2020 election, I said, right now, my favorite thing to call myself is a conservative because I want to conserve the land, the air, the water, the climate system, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. Everything that you guys want to tear down is everything that I want to conserve and defend. And I believe that their party has become a radical, reactionary, nihilistic cult. Is not a conservative party. And so we are the party of everything now, conservatism, liberalism, and progressivism. And I know that there are colleagues of mine, as you say, who want to call themselves radicals or socialists. That's fine. There's room for radicalism. Radicalism is getting to the root of problems. And if they want to get to the root of it, more power to them. But I do warn them, as to me personally, nobody ever has attacked me from my left who doesn't later come to attack me from my right. And I can prove that to you with a whole bunch of cases. So that they might think they're to my left, but I don't think so. In my mind, what is a progressive? A progressive is just the person who gets to the best ideas first. And then everybody else comes around, whether we're talking about abolition of child labor or minimum wage or women's suffrage or abolition. Our country has moved in a progressive direction. So progressivism is always the future. And it's just a question of the people who are going to stick their necks out first to say, we need marriage equality, something that was considered unspeakable and unthinkable, a decade ago. People were saying, when I first announced I was going to run for the state Senate, and people said to me, I'll never forget, I made my speech, I laid out everything I wanted to do in Maryland. I said, we want to abolish the death penalty. We want to increase the minimum wage. We want marriage equality for people. And a woman who was there to support me came up and she said, great speech, Jamie. But one thing, you got to take out everything you got in there about gay marriage, because it's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. And it makes you sound like you're really extreme, like you're not in the political center. And I had to swallow hard because I didn't have that many supporters with me when I first announced that I was running. And I said, you know, I appreciate you saying that to me. And it makes me realize it's not my ambition to be in the political center. It's my ambition to be in the moral center, to try to find what's right, the best that we can, and then bring the political center to us. And I think that that has basically been my public philosophy, that we've got to try to find what's right and then fight for it, as opposed to just take a poll, which are changing all the time anyway, but just take a poll and then chase after that. But the final point, Daniel, forgive me, just the general, I see, you know, my friend AOC and all those guys in primarily generational terms. And here I'm just showing my age. I'm a middle-aged guy. I've got 3 kids who are just out of college or, you know, in their 20s. They see a lot, they see staggering crises in the country. And they see a political and economic system that is not responsive to the needs of their generation. And so they have found the language of socialism to describe what they want. I think that that language is not correct in terms of where they're really going. I mean, when I ask them, like, what do you mean when you say you're a socialist? Basically what they mean is they want national health care. Well, Maggie Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister of the UK, presided over universal health care. You don't have to be a socialist. And, you know, I think that a lot of the people calling themselves socialists, they are not dialectical materialists, which is good, because in my lifetime, socialism has not replaced capitalism. Capitalism has replaced socialism. The socialist economies didn't work that way. So you know, I don't know what they mean exactly when they say it. Maybe Bernie Sanders really does think of himself as a Marxian socialist, but I would love to debate that with him. I also think that Elizabeth Warren's answer to Bernie Sanders was wrong when they said, well, are you a socialist too? And she said, no, I'm a capitalist. A capitalist is somebody who actually has capital and makes investments as a business person. She should have said, I am a progressive liberal reformer who wants to make sure that the government is an instrument for the common good and serving everybody.
Wow, good. All right. Last question before we get to hear from everybody else is, that was a hardball, I'll give you a softball, which is, what surprised you since you arrived in the House 4 years ago? What do you think that public perceptions of the chamber get right, and what do they get wrong?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the first thing that struck me was that one of the major fixtures of life in Annapolis wasn't here. In Annapolis, we really took our hearings so seriously. Now, in Maryland state government, any citizen can come and testify for at least 3 minutes. And then if you get questioning, it can go on more. So we would have hearings that would go on for hours, but the hearings actually really work to help you to get to the bottom of the issues and then the legislation. And on lots of my own bills, I learned a lot from the hearings. And so we made changes in the bills and we made amendments. That's kind of not what hearings are like here in Washington. They are much shorter. Obviously, you can't have every citizen have the right to come and testify, but so then you get a few experts come in. One thing that Washington is better is we don't allow lobbyists to come and testify about the bills, which is a silly practice in Annapolis. But the hearings are basically for show. I think they're getting a little bit better under Democratic control. I've got to say, I know that sounds partisan, but they're not so much just for show anymore. But compared to Annapolis, I mean, they're thin. And so a lot of the work is really going on behind the scenes with staff and so on. So one of the rules changes that I suggested for the new Congress when we took over was that we should at least have to have hearings on bills. But when the Republicans were in control in the 115th Congress, we were voting on tons of bills where there'd been no hearings at all on major things, on the spending of billions of dollars without any hearings. And what that means is that people basically end up voting just in partisan blocks because you're not having a real discussion about what's going on. You're not really analyzing the facts and the data and so on. So that's something that I would like to see change, and to have a kind of deeper engagement through the hearing process. But Capitol Hill is a far more partisan place even than Annapolis. Obviously, there were caucuses in Annapolis, but I remember doing a lot of work with Republicans to get stuff done, and so that's unfortunate. I would like to see much greater cross-partisan and nonpartisan stuff going on. Here's my theory of it. Look, there's a lot of silly denunciation of the political parties, okay, and partisanship. Partisanship is not all bad. Let's give 2 cheers for partisanship. I mean, partisanship is just a reflection of our First Amendment. People have a freedom of association and freedom of speech. And there's some political scientist, you'll remember his name, Daniel, I think it was Duverger, who basically said—
Maurice Duverger,
right? If you've got single member districts, then the electorate will generally sort itself out into 2 big parties, okay? And I mean, I know that's been challenged, and there have been periods of American history where there have been 4 or 5 parties that are more competitive. Generally, the left parties tend to factionalize more, like the progressives and the farm labor and the greenbacks and all that. But in any event, so the party system is good. It helps us to organize the public agenda, articulate issues, send cues to the public about who you want, even if you don't know the names of everybody on the ballot. So it's not all bad. But here's my theory about it as an elected official. Once the election's over, then those of us who are elected have to try to think not in terms of our party, but in terms of the whole. In fact, the word party comes from the French word parti, which just means a part of the whole. Our party is just a part of the broader electorate, and we have to try to serve everybody. And the way to think of it is the way that I hope that all of us do constituent service. And I'm extremely proud of my district office in Rockville, because you call us up with any problem. It could be your VA benefits, it could be your Social Security check, it could be, in COVID-19, you've got a family member who's stuck in Switzerland or Guyana or Canada. We're going to go to bat for you. We don't say, are you a Democrat? Or you Republican? Are you independent? We go to work for you if you live in my district. That's the mentality we've got to bring, not only to the constituent service process, but to the legislative process. I'm not interested in healthcare for everybody, which I believe in, because I want healthcare for Democrats. I want healthcare for all American citizens, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, independents, or what have you. I want clean air and clean water for everybody, regardless of their party registration.
Excellent. So we're now going to questions from the audience, and you can put them in the chat, and then they will magically appear to me, and then I will ask them. Kelly asks a question that I should have asked, which is, how is COVID-19 influencing the transition?
How's it influencing the transition?
Yeah.
Well,
or how's COVID
like
variety of directions, but we've been in the middle of a pandemic and not really talking pandemic. So now's a good time for us to talk pandemic.
It's been a nightmare. I mean, all of the same difficulties that we've been suffering from, that people can't really meet in person, and everything's got to be done at Zoom. And, there's still, massive telecommuting going on in the government offices and so on. And then we had the problem, or continue to have the problem, of the president refusing to recognize the results of the election at the same time. And then not engaging in COVID-19 transition at a time when the death rate is out of control. We are picking up 1 million new cases every week. And we need to reverse that in order to get people to the point of vaccination and mass immunization. But I keep thinking about John Kerry when he got back from the Vietnam War and said, you don't want to be the last man to die for a mistake. I mean, we don't want our people, we don't want our family members to be the last people to die for the mistake and all of the terrible blunders that have been committed by this administration in the COVID-19 response. It's been a calamity, So I hope that that President-elect Biden will be able to inaugurate a new focus on the CDC guidelines, on public health protocols, on science, and unifying the country around that, and that the outgoing team will stop its obstructionist conduct with respect to COVID-19 policy and unity.
Tom asks, question I think you've spent a long time thinking about, which is, what election law changes should be made given the problems we've seen in recent elections? What can Congress do? What would require a constitutional amendment?
Well, that's a great question that's worthy of a whole other meeting at some point. But just like, I'll give you the headlines working our way down. We need a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. We don't have that. We have a ragtag ad hoc sequence of anti-discrimination amendments, like the 15th Amendment on race, the 17th Amendment on direct election of senators, the 19th Amendment, whose centennial we observe, on gender. We have the 23rd Amendment giving people in DC the right to participate in presidential elections, but not congressional elections. But nowhere do you have a universal affirmative grant of voting rights to everybody, which is why we have millions of people from DC to Puerto Rico to American Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, millions of former prisoners who are disenfranchised in different ways. So I think a right to vote amendment, I think that we need to move to ranked choice voting, because in both parties and in general elections, we have lots of people who are attaining to very high office with rather slender pluralities of the vote instead of majorities. And ranked choice voting is a way of making sure that people who win actually have majority support in the country. It also dramatically reduces negative campaigning, because the candidates now, rather than just trying to character assassinate and slander the other side, they have an incentive to go out and say, okay, you love, you love whoever the candidate might be. I want to be your second choice, or make me your third choice, or whatever. So it promotes coalition forming rather than, that kind of thing. It would be great if we had a national electoral commission that worked out a lot of these voting problems. So we're not thrust back into ludicrous debates that have been solved in many parts of the world. Canada's got a national electoral commission. Mexico's got a national electoral Supreme Court. All these are independent, nonpartisan. We still have partisan elected officials at the state level, secretaries of state, who tend to be partisan, who are running our elections. And it puts us in a really fragile and vulnerable state. We got to get rid of the electoral college, and we should elect the president the way that we're electing governors and senators and mayors. Whoever gets the most votes wins, as opposed to this archaic and obsolete system that is vulnerable to so many different kinds of strategic manipulation and corruption. And it's not over yet. Still, on January 6th, we're going to meet in joint session, the House and the Senate, to receive the electors that are being cast today in state capitals across the land, including in Annapolis. And the Republicans are saying that they are going to challenge the introduction of the electors from Georgia, from North Carolina, from Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. There are all these kinds of threats. And then we'll have to resolve into the House and the Senate to consider the objections, assuming that the Democrats still have a majority based on COVID-19 absences and so on. But assuming we have a majority, then they won't be able to overturn the results of the election this way. But it's still, you see, a very fragile catch as catch can kind of situation. So I think we've gotten rid of most of the anti-democratic features of the original Constitution, like the exclusion of African Americans, the exclusion of women, the indirect selection of US senators by state legislatures. And the Electoral College is this dinosaur relic of the beginning of the process. And, we spend hundreds of millions a year promoting democracy and democratic electoral institutions around the world. One thing that we never even try to promote and nobody ever adopts is our Electoral College system. It's not like the Eastern European countries came out of communism and said, yeah, and now we're going to pick your Electoral College system because that's working so well. I mean, the countries of the world are moving where they have presidents to majority election. And that's something that I think we can learn from the rest of the democracies on Earth.
Presidentialism itself Wolf has tensions, but that's a different story. Garen asked, and questions about issue priority and all that, but we want to get to more questions. So Garen asks, what do you anticipate will occur with respect to economic stimulus package, parentheses S, over the coming months?
Well, thank you for that question. As you know, we passed the HEROES Act 7 months ago now in the House of Representatives to pick up where the CARES Act left off. So there would be the PPP funding for small businesses. There would be the unemployment insurance supplement from the feds of $600 a week for people who've been rendered jobless by the economic fallout of COVID-19, as well as the aid to the NIH and the public health infrastructure, both at the federal level and at the state levels. We've lost 1 million employees to state and county layoffs across the country. So the frontline workers, whether we're talking about bus drivers, firefighters, cops, nurses, and so on, have been hit so hard. So that, we had a $3 trillion package in the HEROES Act. Originally, Senator McConnell said, no way. This was back when they were saying this was a blue state disease, let the states go bankrupt for their own recklessness and so on. They're not saying that anymore. Obviously, the entire country has been ravaged by the failure of our government to come up with a plan to defeat COVID-19. And so it's gone from Florida to Arkansas to Alabama, Texas, and so on. It's the whole country. It's not a blue state problem or a red state problem. It's a problem of the whole United States. And so I think that the Senate is now moving towards meeting us, not halfway, but I guess at least a third of the way. There will be something around $1 trillion that will be adopted. Right now, it doesn't include aid to the states and the counties, but there is some money, I guess $300 pegged for unemployment insurance, some money for replenishing the PPP, the small business aid, some money for public health and so on. We don't think it's fully up to the task, but it is better than nothing. Our people are desperate. You saw the food lines around the country during Thanksgiving. We're going to see that again at Christmas. We're going to, we have them in Montgomery County, Maryland, one of the top 10 wealthiest counties in the United States. We had major food lines at churches and places that were passing out food, hundreds and hundreds of people lining up to come and get food. So we've got spreading hunger and unemployment. And this is a problem that was not caused by the people. It was really the result of very reckless and negligent conduct by government officials in responding to COVID-19. And so we should be doing everything we can to get our people through this until we get the mass vaccination and immunization we need.
There have been a bunch of questions on probably more than I would have asked as a political scientist on the theme of unity and bringing people together and how that can happen and what the president can do and what you in Congress can do. And so how we think about those, and in turn, I'm gonna maybe reveal the political scientist pessimism to say, what are the things you can do and what are the things you can't?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I get that after a period of such fractious disunity and combat from the very top of the government, the demonization and vilification of political opponents, or even people in the president's party and reporters and judges and, all of the racism and anti-Semitism that have been unleashed in the public. People are craving some sense of constitutional patriotism and some sense of social cohesion. And, all I can say is we've got to fight for it every single day. Our Constitution is an Enlightenment Constitution. And Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison wanted us to be able to unify around reason and around data, which is why we have a census every 10 years, and around commitment to science and making progress through empiricism. And then in terms of religious faith and worship, everybody could do whatever they wanted, and it's not the government's business to be dictating to you your relationship to God or your church, or whether or not you're even going to have one. That's up to you. But the government in the public space has got to be the realm where reason operates. And of course, everybody can bring their values, and their values can import their religious convictions and understandings, or their philosophical or literary or moral, ethical, or what have you. But the government itself should not be involved in trying to dictate religious dogma. And of course, this administration's gotten it completely backwards. They've tried to purge science and purge reason, and instead embrace institutional religious dogma and promote religious institutions, which the president saw as politically favorable to him. So we've got to restore the basic constitutional precepts and understanding of the country. At the same time that we show, what Lincoln talked about, those bonds of affection that do hold us together, that Americans are all Americans, regardless of what our political party or ideology is. But like you, I don't want to overstate the possibilities of that. I mean, even in the best of times, people have different value systems and different views of the world, but this is not the best of times, because we've had an alternative media system that's been promoting propaganda for many years now. And there are people who believe that Donald Trump won the election, despite the fact that he lost by 7 million votes and 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, the same margin he won by 4 years ago, which he declared to be a landslide against Hillary Clinton. He lost the election, but there are millions of people now who accept the conspiracy theory that he won the election. Well, that's a dangerous thing for democracy, to have that kind of derangement from the facts and from reality.
Question from Harvey, which is, can you comment on the problem of rebuilding our diplomatic service after the loss of so much talent in the past 4 years?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and it's been a big problem since there's been a war on the diplomatic service that the country got a glimpse of during the impeachment trial, with the testimony of all of these great civil servants around the world who were just being manipulated and exploited and ultimately marginalized and expelled by political appointees who were on political missions. The good news is, I think that I know this because I represent Maryland's 8th District, Montgomery, Frederick, and Carroll County, where we have thousands of people who work in the diplomatic service, in the State Department, and in different foreign policy contexts. And they are brilliant, engaged people who've devoted their whole careers and lives to this. And most of them ended up leaving the government in one way or another, but they haven't left the field, and they're very eager to go back. And I know, because I'm trying to advance their applications to get back in the government, there are thousands of people who want to get back and try to rebuild and reconnect. And I know it's part of the Biden-Harris platform to get right back into the Paris Climate Accords. I mean, we went from being, one of the world's major leaders on confronting climate change to an international environmental outlaw and pariah state. We're going to have to move very quickly to get back on top of that, and to get back on top of the problem of terrorist financing all over the world. And like this resolution that I was telling you about that I got passed last week, got to get back on the side of human rights and religious freedom, and defending people against the authoritarian thugs, from Putin in Russia to Orban in Hungary to Duterte in the Philippines to El-Sisi in Egypt or Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, there's a war on democracy going on. We were in league with those people, if we can speak plainly, during the last administration, right? I mean, it was like it was like every Batman villain. It was like the Joker and the Riddler and everything. We were the ringleader of them. And now we've got to go back to demanding human rights for the people who are under the gun, for reporters in Egypt and political oppositionists in Turkey who've been thrown in prison, the Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia who have been criminalized and had their property confiscated. We've got to go back to being a defender of human rights.
I think this may be the last question. So given that confirmations run through the Senate. That's why I asked about the waiver earlier. You're not going to have a direct role in those, but lots of questions about what that's going to look like. CJ says, what's the timeline for the Senate approvals of President-elect Biden's appointments? Does it take place bit by bit, or is there a particular date? The answer to which is no, there is not a particular date. Can some Senate approvals be delayed? The answer to which is yes, they can be delayed. Similarly, question of what major challenges do you anticipate for Biden in appointing senior positions to his cabinet? How you see that process, and obviously we don't know who's got majority control, how you see it playing out, and what your thoughts are on who's been appointed and what might happen. Obviously that you don't have an immediate set of votes to cast on these nominees other than the waiver.
President-elect Biden has understandably relied on major personnel from the Obama administration, people he worked with as vice president. And, all of that is predictable enough, and on longtime aides he trusts, including my friend Ron Klain, who's my constituent and was my law school classmate as chief of staff, and Anthony Blinken, another person I went to school with. See, if you get old enough, you start knowing everybody. The real question, I guess, is who's going to be the next level down, the sub-cabinet level. And that's where a lot of the progressives are going to be fighting hard to say, okay, put some people in who are reflective of the progressive wing of the party that lost to Joe Biden, but still spoke to tens and galvanized tens of millions of people, the Bernie supporters and Elizabeth Warren supporters and Castro and so on. So I think that we will see, I'm getting a note from you, Daniel, about how you were Jared Kushner's classmate. However, you must be a young man.
My secret has been revealed.
Yeah. But I assume you got into college the old-fashioned way. You didn't endow any buildings or anything. No, okay. But I think that that's where you will see much more of a struggle within the Democratic Party. Although I don't want to overstate what that struggle is. I mean, I think that to the extent there are people who are going to challenge the Trump orthodoxy in the Republican Party, that will be a really ferocious struggle for the future and the character of the Republican Party. I think on the Democratic side, the kinds of issues people used to fight about before, like, are we going to be a pro-choice party or not? Are we going to be a pro-marriage equality party? That stuff is over, So, and I think everybody agrees that we've got to be a party that is anchored in the economic and social dreams of the great American working class. But what does that mean? What are the actual policies that we're going to use to uplift people across lines of race and ethnicity and so on? Obviously, at least from my perspective, identity politics alone is not a program for uplifting the people. And so there's a limit. I mean, that's fine. Identity politics has a deep history in American electoral life on both sides of the aisle. I mean, you could view Donald Trump as a complete creature and product and exponent of identity politics, of white male identity politics. But there's a limit to that. That's not actually how you change the world and how you make life better for people using identity politics, even identity politics for those who've been left out. Everybody's got to be at the table. We need to be a totally inclusive party, the Democrats. We need to be a party that's reflective of the diversity of the country as we are. But that itself is not an economic program. That's not a political program. That is just a statement of the preconditions for how we're going to make progress.
So we have come to the end here, and I want to remind the audience that Rep. Raskin and I have been sharing our personal views during this chat and do not represent those of the Johns Hopkins institutions. So thank you, everybody, for joining us at Hopkins at Home. Thank you, Representative Raskin, and to Camille for your time.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. Let's do it again. Camille, thank you for having the brainstorm to invite me, and Professor Schlozman, wonderful to meet you. And next time, maybe we can even wade into the gallery and see, I can meet some of the great Hopkins people who are out there.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I really appreciate you doing this. I learn a lot every time I hear you speak, so I enjoy it. Thank you.
Totally my pleasure. All best. Happy holidays. Stay safe, everybody.
Bye-bye.